Israeli forces did not begin to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor as agreed. And on the 2nd of March, the Israeli government announced it was blocking all further aid deliveries until Hamas agreed to its terms. Ultimately, of course, these are matters for the courts, not governments, to determine. But it's difficult to see how denying humanitarian assistance to a civilian population can be compatible with international humanitarian law.
We need Israel to continue seeing the UK as a trusted partner. The strength of Britain's relationship with Israel also matters for our wider influence in the Middle East. If we undermine our relationship and influence with Israel, we also lose influence across the Middle East. Careless comments do not help, including the Foreign Secretary's remarks of this House on Monday, for which has been rebuked by the Prime Minister.
It's been estimated that in the opening salvos of this appalling aggression, the Israelis killed 80 Palestinian children in the space of 51 minutes. There have been reports of children going through amputations without anaesthetics due to the blockade. And of course, it's been reported that leaflets were dropped across Gaza last night threatening extermination. Surely, even for the government, the Israelis have now crossed a monstrous red line.
Can I thank the Leader of the House for her responses this morning, which brings us to the statement on the conflict in Gaza. Foreign Secretary.
Well, with permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement about the conflict in Gaza. In January, I outlined to the House the deal agreed between Israel and Hamas. It was a moment of huge hope and relief in the weeks that followed. Hostages cruelly detained by Hamas were reunited with their families, and aid blocked by Israel finally flooded into Gaza. A path out of this horrendous conflict appeared open. It's therefore as a matter of deep regret to have to update the House today on a breakdown of the ceasefire and yet more bloodshed in Gaza. On the night of the 18th of March, Israel launched airstrikes across Gaza. A number of Hamas figures were reportedly killed, but it's been reported that over 400 Palestinians were killed in missile strikes and artillery barrages. The majority of them were women and children. This appears to have been the deadliest single day for Palestinians since the war began. This is an appalling loss of life, and we mourn the loss of every civilian. Yesterday morning, a UN compound in Gaza was hit. I can confirm to the House that a British national was amongst the wounded. Our priority is supporting them and their family at this time. Gaza has been the most dangerous place in the world to be an aid worker. And I share the outrage of the UN Secretary General Guterres at this incident. The government calls for a transparent investigation and for those responsible to be held to account. The UK is now working closely with partners such as France and Germany to send a clear message. We strongly oppose Israel's resumption of hostilities. We urgently want to see a return to a ceasefire. More bloodshed is in no one's interests. Hamas must release all the hostages and negotiations must resume. Madam Deputy Speaker, diplomacy is the only way to achieve security for both Israelis and Palestinians. The House will know that the ceasefire in Gaza had lasted for almost 2 months, the result of dogged efforts by Egypt, Qatar and the United States. The deal reached in January saw the nightmare of captivity for 30 hostages and the bodies of 8 further victims of Hamas returned to their loved ones. And we all remember the joy of seeing Emily Damari reunited with her mother and family and the desperately needed aid that had begun to flow back into Gaza: food, medicines, fuel, tents. Children in Gaza had respite from relentless fear. The severely injured could cross the border again for treatment. Palestinians had begun to return to their homes and consider how to rebuild their lives. In the first days of the ceasefire, the UK moved swiftly to invest in the peace. We released £17 million in additional emergency humanitarian funding for the promised surge in aid. We were bringing our total support this year for Palestinians across the region to £129 million. We accelerated work on the pathway to reconstruction, supporting our Arab partners' very welcome recent initiative. And we worked at every level to support negotiations for a permanent ceasefire and the return of every single hostage, and a backed extension to phase 1 of the current deal. But negotiations have been gridlocked for several weeks. Hamas has been resisting calls for release of further hostages in return for a longer truce. Israeli forces did not begin to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor as agreed. And on the 2nd of March, the Israeli government announced it was blocking all further aid deliveries until Hamas agreed to its terms. For weeks now, supplies of basic goods and electricity have been blocked, leaving over 500,000 civilians once again cut off from clean drinking water and sparking a 200% surge in the price of some basic foodstuffs, a boon to those criminals who use violence to control supplies. As I told the House on Monday, this is appalling and unacceptable. Ultimately, of course, these are matters for the courts, not governments, to determine. But it's difficult to see how denying humanitarian assistance to a civilian population can be compatible with international humanitarian law. Though it's important to say I could have been a little clearer in the House on Monday, our position remains that Israel's actions in Gaza are a clear risk of breaching international humanitarian law. The consequences of the ceasefire's breakdown, Madam Deputy Speaker, are catastrophic. For the family and friends of the remaining 59 hostages, including Avinatan Or, the agony goes on. Hamas's kidnapping of these people, their treatment of them in captivity, the cruel theatre of their release, depriving them of food and basic rights, these are acts of despicable cruelty. Hamas must release them all now. And Palestinian civilians who have already endured so much now must fear a rerun and a return to days of death, deprivation and destruction. Civilians have once again been issued with evacuation orders by Israel. Only 4% of the United Nations flash appeal is funded, not even enough to get through to the end of this month. Health centres have had to close, even as the devastated Gazan health service has to treat another surge of those wounded in strikes. Madam Deputy Speaker, Hamas can have no role in Gaza's future, but a collapsed ceasefire will not bring the hostages home to their families. An endless conflict will not bring long-term security to Israel, and a deepening war will only set back the cause of regional normalisation and risk further instability. Shortly after the Houthis resumed their unacceptable threats to shipping in the Red Sea. Madam Deputy Speaker, since the renewed outbreak of hostilities, I have spoken to Secretary Rubio, to EU High Representative Kallas, to the UN Emergency Coordinator Tom Fletcher, and I will shortly speak to my Israeli counterpart Gideon Saar and the Palestinian Prime Minister Mustafa. We and our partners need to persuade the parties that this conflict cannot be resolved by military means. We want Israel and Hamas to re-engage with negotiations. We continue to condemn Hamas, of course, for their actions on October the 7th, for their refusal to release the hostages and their ongoing threat to Israel, but we are also resolute in calling on Israel to abide by international law and to lift the unacceptable restrictions on aid and demand the protection of civilians. Many months ago, only weeks into office, I concluded that there was a clear risk of Israel breaching international humanitarian law in Gaza. It was this risk that I first set out in the House back in September, which meant that the government suspended relevant export licences for items for use by the IDF in military operations in Gaza. The actions of last week only reinforce that conclusion. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the days and weeks ahead, we will redouble our efforts to restore a ceasefire, but we will also continue to work with our partners on the security, governance and reconstruction arrangements. Those issues are not going away. There remains no military solution to this conflict. A two-state solution remains the only path to a just and lasting peace. At this dispatch box in January, I called the ceasefire deal a glimmer of light in the darkness. It feels like the darkness has returned. Former British hostage Emily Damari said the resumption of fighting left her heartbroken, crushed and disappointed. I'm sure she speaks for the whole House, but we must preserve hope for the sake of the remaining hostages and their loved ones, for the people of Gaza, for the future of two peoples that have suffered so much for so long. We will keep striving for a return to the path to peace. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for the advanced side of his statement. We all mourn the loss of innocent lives in this appalling conflict. The death of the UN aid worker and the injury to a British national is tragic, and our sympathies and thoughts are with their families. Can the Foreign Secretary provide an update on the direct engagement he has had with key interlocutors in the region to ascertain the facts around what happened, and has he been updated by the government of Israel on their investigation? The onward transition at the end of phase one of the ceasefire agreement was always going to be challenging. This is a difficult and a really fragile moment for the Middle East. But several basic truths remain unchanged, including the urgency to return to their loved ones, the 59 hostages captured by Hamas terrorists during the atrocities of October the 7th. This is vital for achieving a sustainable end to this horrendous conflict. The incredibly brave families of those held hostage remain firmly in our thoughts, and we should be very clear, the onus is squarely on Hamas. Hamas could agree to release these hostages now and avert any escalation. This is the moment for the UK government to show leadership with the international community to exert maximum pressure on Hamas to release these hostages. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should all fully understand who we are dealing with here. A brutal Iranian-backed terrorist organisation that seeks the destruction of the world's only Jewish state, which uses its own defenceless people as human shields, and which has ruthlessly eradicated fundamental freedoms in Gaza. Anyone who has read the shocking report from Lord Roberts and commissioned by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Israel on October the 7th would have seen the harrowing details of the real-life consequences of Hamas, complete with a total disdain of their human dignity and the utter disregard for human life, visceral anti-Semitism and murderous intentions. The organised brutality, murder, rape and torture indiscriminately targeting babies, children, women and the elderly. As the Prime Minister himself once said, Hamas bears responsibility. Is that still the Prime Minister's and the government's position? Madam Deputy Speaker, it is abundantly clear that Iranian-backed Hamas can have no role in the future of Gaza, and we have raised this many times in this House. So what exactly is the British government doing at this moment in time to bear down on Hamas, work with partners to put an end to this brutal regime? What assessment has he made of the capabilities of Hamas and the ongoing threat the terrorists pose to peace and stability in the region? Does the government support the US proposal for securing the release of hostages? What is his vision of the next steps? Does he believe the phase 2 of the ceasefire remains within reach, or is he considering alternative solutions? There is too much at stake for Britain to be a bystander. We must be a proactive player with involvement. The Foreign Secretary mentioned his talks with France and Germany, but what discussions is he having with Egypt and other regional partners? We need Israel to continue seeing the UK as a trusted partner. The strength of Britain's relationship with Israel also matters for our wider influence in the Middle East. If we undermine our relationship and influence with Israel, we also lose influence across the Middle East. Careless comments do not help, including the Foreign Secretary's remarks to this House on Monday, for which has been rebuked by the Prime Minister, so will he apologise to the House and to Israel? The Foreign Secretary's focus should be on securing the release of the 59 remaining hostages, and this House should be united in that. Those hostages are held by Hamas since the atrocities of October the 7th, which is important and sustainable to end this conflict. Let's be clear, Hamas has no respect for international law, human life or human rights. So does the Foreign Secretary agree that we must be unequivocal that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas and the democratically elected government of Israel, and we must have no more poorly judged decisions on arms exports designed to placate his backbenchers? On the question of aid to Gaza, which perhaps the backbenchers would like to take seriously, I have said from this dispatch box before that we expect detail about the government's practical response on the ground. How is the government working to unblock the situation? And what is happening to British aid that is already in the region or en route? What discussions has he had with Israeli counterparts in recent days? What is his assessment of the reports of Hamas stockpiling aid and the impact this has on distribution to civilians in need? Has he held discussions recently with the Red Cross on their very important work on hostage release and aid delivery? Can we be doing more to support the ICRC's work here? And on the region more broadly, as the Parliamentary Commission report makes crystal clear, we cannot ignore the role of the regime in Tehran, which has its fingerprints over so much of this inhumane suffering and bloodshed that we see today. We need action to deter Iran's malign agenda. So what options are on the table to tackle Iran and the flow of weapons and support to their terrorist proxies? What hard power options is he considering in respect to the Houthis? I did not receive answers on Monday in this House on that. I asked the Foreign Secretary on Monday as well whether Britain is in lockstep with the United States, but he did not answer that. So now is the time for him to provide clarity and clear answers.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and let me just make clear on the charity worker who was injured that, of course, our ambassador and the Foreign Office are in touch with his family, and as she would expect, we have made representations to the Israeli government, and I will be speaking to the Israeli Foreign Minister in the coming hours. She talks about Hamas, and I have said at this dispatch box that the scenes of those young men in balaclavas with Kalashnikovs parading hostages are obscene, and I condemn them. I said in January that we would continue to stand with the hostage families, and we will. There are still dozens of families waiting, hoping, praying that their loved ones can return. But I tell her too that she will have seen overnight that there are many of those families saying this is not the way to bring them home. They fear that as a consequence of this resumed action, their loved ones will perish. And so I thought the tone of some of her remarks did not sit with what I see coming out of Israel at this side. No one could not be absolutely touched and affected by the gaunt and malnourished hostages paraded around in a sick propaganda exercise. We all condemn Hamas. But I tell her too, when she asks what we are doing, and actually what the last government did, is we are supporting the Palestinian Authority with reform, because there has to be an alternative to Hamas, and the alternative to Hamas is the Palestinian Authority. And we've got to work with them. You've got to give people hope and prospect that isn't about terrorism. And that is about supporting Prime Minister Mustafa in all of his efforts, particularly, and that is what we've been doing, and that is why we've been working with the Arab Quint particularly. There was to be, she asked me about how we're working with partners in the area, there was to be a conference a gathering in Egypt this weekend. It has been postponed, but it will be very important that we attend that gathering and work with our Arab partners. And I put on record our support of Egypt and Qatar in their conversations with Hamas. She knows that we don't talk to Hamas, but we do work with those partners who can. She asked me about future operations in the Red Sea, and she knows very well that I would never comment from this dispatch box about operational issues in the Red Sea. She asked me if there's any moral equivalence between Hamas and the Israeli government. Of course there's no moral equivalence between Hamas and the Israeli government. None of us have ever suggested that is the case. And she asked me quite rightly about the role of Iran, and she's right about the malign effect of Iran in the region, and we will act to ensure that they do not get the nuclear capability that they are seeking to secure. And this was an issue that I discussed with Secretary of State Rubio and my counterparts in France and in Germany.
Select Committee Chair Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much. Can I begin by thanking the Foreign Secretary for his passionate and articulate plea for peace from the dispatch box. In doing so, I know that he speaks for all of us, and I know that he has witnessed the suffering and feels it very deeply, as we all do. The renewed bombing in Gaza cannot be justified. The renewed siege of Gaza cannot be justified. And it is difficult to see how that is compatible, either of those are compatible with international law. It will be for a court to decide, and there will be a reckoning. The question is, though, is what's going to happen now? Because whatever it is that the British government is doing in the region, it is clearly not working. So the question is, what is Plan B? What is Plan B? Now that the Israeli government has abandoned the fragile course of peace, what is Plan B for the West Bank, which still faces the threat of annexation, and following reports of these strikes, that those strikes may have American endorsement? What is Plan B when it comes to uniting our international allies to make sense of this senseless violation of the peace process? That we need to make sure that it is met not just with words, no matter how passionate and no matter how articulate. We have to do something, and we need to do something internationally and with our allies. Now is the time to stop talking about it and do something.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and I know that she was in the region very recently and discussing these very same issues at the Knesset. And let me say to her that the US envoy, Steve Witkoff, I understand, is flying into the area as we speak. And I hold out hope that we can still get to a ceasefire once more that gets us to the plan, which was to the end of the Passover period, and I can't give up hope on that. She says we've got to have more than words. She knows, as I do, that the business of diplomacy is words, is conversations, is using our influence to bring this about. And that's why we're working very closely with the United States, with our Arab partners, and of course with E3 partners particularly, and the European Union at this time. And I will do everything I can to get us back to that ceasefire.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to the Minister for the advance sight of this statement. Israel resuming its military campaign in Gaza is heartbreaking for all Palestinians, for the remaining hostages and their families, and for the world. For 2 months, the fragile ceasefire provided space for the release of hostages, and until early March, the flooding of Gaza with vital aid to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians. The resumption of fighting now threatens the lives of both the Israeli hostages, still held in captivity by Hamas, and Palestinians who have already seen their homes and communities devastated by 15 months of war. A new ceasefire must be secured as soon as possible. To this end, what discussions has the Foreign Secretary had with the Israeli government on rapidly recommitting to a ceasefire? Even before the resumption of military operations, the Israeli government had cut aid routes into Gaza, as well as the supply of electricity. This was illegal and wrong, contravening Israel's obligations under international law. In this House on Monday and today, the Foreign Secretary stated that Israel's aid blockade was a breach of international law. Will the Foreign Secretary outline what action he is taking to ensure there are consequences to breaching international law? Hamas must also now immediately and unconditionally release the remaining hostages, the treatment of whom while in captivity has been despicable. We're also deeply concerned by reports that a British bomb disposal expert has been injured in an explosion at a UN facility in the Strip, and our thoughts are with their family. Can the Foreign Secretary also update the House on his safety and condition? Arab states have a vital role to play in supporting the transition back to a state of ceasefire. Their plan to the reconstruction of Gaza also provides a pragmatic proposal for rebuilding the Strip, particularly when compared to the reckless proposals put forward by Trump, who described his intention to remove Palestinians from Gaza. Can the Foreign Secretary confirm that he has engaged closely with Arab partners in the region around their plans for reconstruction? As conflict returns to Gaza, we also need to give Palestinians hope and show them that we support their right to statehood. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the UK must now move to officially recognise a state of Palestine as a vital part of a two-state solution which offers dignity and security to Palestinians and Israelis?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Since the renewed outbreak of hostilities, can I assure her that I've spoken to Secretary Rubio, I've spoken to EU High Representative Kai Kallas, and we're closely coordinated. I met with the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher, in New York just last Friday, and we were discussing the issues in Gaza. And of course, I expect to speak to my counterpart, Gideon Saar, and Palestinian Prime Minister Mustafa very shortly. We're working very closely with our E3 partners particularly, and she will also have seen that there was a closed meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Tuesdays, in which we made strong representations. She'll also be aware that these issues were discussed, and she'll have seen the communiqué that flowed from the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting last week in Canada. As I have now said on 10 occasions since September, Israel's actions in Gaza are a clear risk, or at a clear risk, of breaching international humanitarian law. The government's been clear all along that we're not an international court, and we could not make a judgment as to whether Israel has breached international humanitarian law. But I made a decision back in September based on whether there was a clear risk, and for that reason we have suspended those sales to Gaza, and they'll continue to be suspended. And let me tell her also that in relation to the British hostages, we are in relation to the British charity worker who has been wounded, we are of course in contact with his family, and I intend to keep the House updated.
Melanie Ward.
Deputy Speaker, and I want to say thank you to the Foreign Secretary for all the work that he and his team are doing behind the scenes on this horrific issue. And I have to say it is quite shocking that the Shadow Foreign Secretary appears unable to say the word Palestinian. And as someone who used to be an international aid worker and was in Gaza, I want to say that the lives of Palestinian aid workers are every bit as valuable as the lives of international aid workers. And more than 170 Palestinian children have been killed this week alone. And yesterday, the Israeli Defence Minister threatened the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
Question, then I will assist. Please carry on with the question.
Yesterday, the Israeli Defence Minister threatened the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. What action is the Foreign Secretary taking to stop this and to hold the government of Israel accountable for its actions?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that humanitarian aid should never be used as a political tool, and Israel must restart the aid immediately. This is a time when a lot of diplomatic activity is going on. As I said, Steve Witkoff, the envoy, has flown into the area, and we are in touch with the US. I am closely working with E3 and the EU. In fact, I will be speaking very shortly to my French counterpart. We have not given up hope. I sense that there has been a loss of hope in this chamber that we can get back to a ceasefire, but I'm telling you now, this Foreign Secretary has not given up hope that we can get back to a ceasefire. It's my job to try and do the best to deliver that, and that is what I intend to do over the coming hours.
Is the point of order absolutely relevant right now? Priti Patel.
I seek your advice, Madam Deputy Speaker, on just the clarification on the misrepresentation that I have not spoken about the Palestinian Authority in this House at the dispatch box when I have on a number of occasions, Madam Deputy Speaker.
We need to make sure can we please be seated? This is a very sensitive and important debate. We need to make sure that language is tempered and respectful at all times. Our constituents and indeed the world is watching, and we need to make sure that we are not in any way inadvertently misrepresenting each other and our colleagues. But it is noted, but we will now continue. We have a lot of people to get through. Father of the House.
I agree with everything the Foreign Secretary has said, and particularly we have to give hope to the Palestinian people. To be fair to the Israeli government position, Hamas could solve this now if they release the hostages. But having said that, it is surely wrong, would the Foreign Secretary agree that it is quite wrong for anybody in the Israeli government to say that the Gazan people could rise up against Hamas? If you do that, you'll best be tortured or probably killed. The people of Gaza are victims of Hamas as much as anybody. And it is quite wrong for the Israeli government to inflict collective judgment on the people of Gaza. This will bring death, destruction, more radicalism, and will never get the hostages home.
Well, the Father of the House speaks with tremendous authority. And that is why I've said, look, none of us stand with Hamas. All of us want to see Hamas removed. But you have to provide an alternative to Hamas. And it seems to me that alternative is the Palestinian Authority and working alongside people to undermine Hamas. We also have to see the end of Hamas. And there are ways. We did it in Northern Ireland with de-arming. There are ways to bring this about. But they are best done through diplomatic and political solutions, not military endeavour.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The double standards and injustice we are witnessing on the international stage is truly appalling. It's obvious that Israel is breaking international law, as every serious legal expert on international law has pointed out. And it's shameful, frankly, that the government refuses to state that about Israel, but will rightly do so about Russia's violation in Ukraine. And I say to the Foreign Secretary, the concern and outrage he expresses at the dispatch box is not ending the bloodshed. When will we get the scale of sanctions on Israel that its war crimes demand?
What can I say to the Honourable Gentleman? The conflict has gone on for 526 painful days. And I recognise the strength of feeling after more than 49,000 people have been killed in Gaza. It's a staggering amount of people. He would not expect me to, from this dispatch box, comment on any further sanctions. But of course we keep these issues under close review.
Kit Malthouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been estimated that in the opening salvos of this appalling aggression, the Israelis killed 80 Palestinian children in the space of 51 minutes. There have been reports of children going through amputations without anaesthetics due to the blockade. And of course, it's been reported that leaflets were dropped across Gaza last night threatening extermination. Surely, even for the government, the Israelis have now crossed a monstrous red line. Now, the Foreign Secretary talks about equivalence. I'm assuming that he believes that the Palestinian civilians and their lives are equivalent to the lives of Israeli citizens and also are equivalent to the lives of Ukrainian citizens. This morning, ministers were out on the airwaves offering British troops to keep the peace between Ukraine and Russia. What is it about the Palestinian people that means they're less deserving of that kind of protection?
A whole generation of Gazans are growing up in the most unbearable conditions, and I know that the Honourable Gentleman has been a champion of those children, children who we saw rummaging around in the rubble, children who are now orphaned. So many, thousands of children in Gaza out of school. So it's absolutely right that he brings their plight to this House. But the way forward we were shown back at the beginning of January, which is a ceasefire, negotiations to getting to phase 2, getting to phase 3, and a horizon to a two-state solution. That is what I will continue to fight for.